Middle-earth: Shadow of War is a sequel to a game I covered last month, Shadow of Mordor. The main quest still follows the same characters from that game, being Talion, a ranger who is sacrificed along with his entire family, and Celebrimbor, a wraith guy who brought Talion back to life and gives him a lot of cool abilities. In the original game, you were just sacrificed and began your mission to get revenge on the Black Hand of Sauron, and you have the general goal of fighting back against Sauron himself eventually. Throughout the game, you get a ton of interesting and varied abilities that you use to both tear through Sauron's army and eventually turn them into your own army through taking control of captains and war chiefs. At the end of the game, you beat the Black Hand and you're left with the cliffhanger of it being time to make a new ring, referring to the rings in the Lord of the Rings that make people really powerful. Going into Shadow of War, you see Talion and Celebrimbor creating a new ring, then getting attacked by a spider lady who takes the ring from them. You are then led into a sort of stronghold city area that is overrun by Sauron's army, and the game actually begins. I admittedly have not gotten extremely far into the game story-wise, as I've mainly been wanting to look at its mechanics and how it is different from the original game, which I loved mainly for its mechanics. Also, the first game didn't have a difficulty setting, while I set this game's difficulty to brutal, so my complaints about it being difficult can be partially due to that. I have not played on a lower difficulty, but I do still believe that most of the issues that I will be pointing out will apply to other difficulty settings as well. It won't just be because it's on brutal. Last thing I want to say before starting is that I really didn't like how this game was made, but that's only because it's a sequel to a game I absolutely loved. The game has many problems that the first game didn't have, but it's still overall a decent game. I'm just comparing it to the first game, and I don't believe this is how a sequel to that game should have been done. It is still a good game, but I would still much rather play the first game as it's just more fun. So I will explain why I think that. I'll be showing gameplay on the screen to show what the game is like, but if you want to know more details on the mechanics themselves, most of them are ripped from the first game, so you can watch my previous video on that game for that. I will be describing the abilities that I use on the screen, like through text, but I won't actually go into detail with my voice recording. Anyways, the first thing I did when I started the game was I began to try to learn the controls, and I looked at the abilities that I had and would unlock in the future, and I noticed something that bothered me. I had some abilities that I had to unlock in the first game just straight out of the gate, while other more basic abilities from the first game I had to unlock in the future. The game explains this by having Celebrimbor say that he put everything he had into forging the ring, but that feels like an excuse as to why you don't have some of the more fun or powerful endgame abilities, rather than a proper part of this game's story. And it doesn't really make sense that you still have some abilities that you had to unlock in the first game, but lose other more basic abilities that you unlocked in the first game. The story, the sort of resetting and changing what abilities a character has thing is common in sequel games, but oftentimes those come with a reason, being that you either had all your stuff stolen from you or you're just a completely different character, so you need to start from the beginning. But here it just feels like they wanted to start fresh and have the player redo the entire first game, but in a different world with barely different abilities. The scope of the game grew significantly from the first, with many more enemies and larger areas to fight through. So I was going to go into this game So if I was to go into this game with at least most of the abilities I had in the first game and a new roster of abilities to unlock in the future, it would be an incredible experience. It would be an upgrade from the past game. But instead, you have to complete a large chunk of the story just to get back the ability to even create an army. This ability is one of the best things about the first game, in my opinion, and it's something that I had a lot of fun with, and that would be really fun with a larger, more expansive world. But throughout the entire beginning half of the second game, I couldn't use it, and thus the game feels much more empty because of that. It feels like the first game was simply stripped down and given a few new maps that rather than feeling like an actual sequel to the original story and a sequel to the original characters, if that makes sense. Before I go further into depth with the gameplay, I want to mention something that immediately drew me out of the story. While it does seem to get better later on, the original interactions with the people characters in the game bother me a lot. One reason why is that they recreated the models for Talion, Celebrimbor, and added a bunch of new characters, and I really dislike how they look compared to the characters in the original game. In the first game, I did think Talion's shoulders were a bit wide and it did sometimes look funny, but he mostly appeared like a person. While in the sequel, the facial hair and the face shape are just off putting and immediately pull me out of the game whenever I see him in a cutscene. And Celebrimbor's face resembles a raisin rather than his original look. He originally always had wrinkles, but in the first game I could see him as a human character, while now he resembles a monster too much. Interactions between the characters also draw me out of the game, such as the interactions between Talion and Celebrimbor in some of the story missions. The moments when you gain new abilities in a story mission feel much more forced, as if the mission was made simply to add in that ability. While in the first game, the abilities from the story missions actually felt naturally weaved into the story missions themselves and into you binding with this guy. Along with that, the missions in general are much more straightforward and the landscape is extremely basic in the city areas, so none of the missions stand out in my mind. They all just involved doing something in the city and killing large groups of enemies. When I first interacted with people characters, I realized one of the reasons I was going to dislike this game more than the first, as it puts you into a place with an established army of people. In the first game, you did interact with groups that were escaped slaves of Sauron's army, and they were weak because of it. But in the game, But in this game, you are often surrounded by normal fighters, and they can actually kill captains that are about to kill you, taking away the experience of captains getting stronger and you getting revenge on them. In the first game, the characters you actually got to see and interact with felt special. There were slaves that you could help free, as well as individual people with their own backstories and story arcs, and each one helped you in a significant way. In this game, many of the characters you meet in the first half are just bland army people who never have any fun lines or interesting dialogue. Even the first enemy you team up with, Bruce, I think I'm saying that right, probably like Bruce, is a poor attempt to remake the first enemy you team up with in the first game, Ratbag. Ratbag was much more smoothly put into the game, and he was actually acting under his own control. And his being weak caused you to have to learn to help your enemies that you team up with grow after you take control of them and get stronger over time. With Bruce, you just take control of him and he starts talking to you and spitting off one liners and giving you lots of story exposition. It doesn't feel natural and he doesn't feel special. And him being extremely strong doesn't make me want to do anything to actually build him up. Okay, now I'm going to be going over the actual fighting for my last comparison. Again, I'm playing on the brutal difficulty, but that mainly affects the enemy AI and the damage that enemies deal, which isn't an issue I have with the game's difficulty, as having each hit matter is a really cool way of making even the most basic grunts lethal. The issue I have with the game changes its envi- The issue is that the game changes its environments so that there are constantly 20 times the amount of enemies in an area than there would have been in the first game. The first game was difficult, but fun, because only the most dangerous areas were actually filled to the brim with enemies, and the captains all had a chance to grow more powerful and gain more resistances and strength over time. But in Shadow of Mordor, there are just insane amounts of enemies everywhere you go, and anytime you try to fight a captain, you will be overwhelmed with grunts and archers or hunters, which use ranged weapons that are extremely hard to dodge when you are stuck in a huge pile of enemies trying to kill somebody. This still wouldn't be much of an issue if not for the fact that there are constantly multiple hunters around on the ground and archers on top of the buildings, which again are placed everywhere, unlike in the first game, where the area is mostly made up of plains. The goal isn't to throw difficult enemies at you in this game, it's just to overwhelm you, and that isn't a fun way of playing this general type of game, especially not from the very start when you're low level. To make matters worse, the way enemies are designed, they still are insanely difficult to beat. The original game had a system where high ranking enemies had multiple strengths and weaknesses and resistances. That meant you had to adapt to each enemy you fought. But higher level enemies are restricted to the second half of the game, and you could always abuse an enemy's weaknesses somehow to beat them. In the sequel, they decided to make things even harder by actually adding an adaptation ability to your enemies, at least the high ranking enemies. If you attack them in a certain way too much, then they will become immune to it for the rest of the fight. That means that if they're immune to all but one attack and you try to kill them using only that attack, they may just adapt to it so that you no longer can hit them with that. They no longer have a weakness and are immune to everything that you can do to them. Some even regenerate health if they're left alone for too long, so you can't just lead them into a new area or leave them to regenerate your own health. You oftentimes will just be stuck in an impossible fight with waves upon waves of grunts and ranged fighters attacking you. They do add some interesting abilities that help you kill enemies faster, like allowing countering enemies to immediately kill them once you upgrade that. But I would rather have a fighting game where I can actually think about what I'm doing rather than just a fight where I just counter and dodge everything that is thrown at me and hope that I don't get a spear thrown at me. I honestly don't like how this game was made. It feels like it could have been an interesting challenge to test what you've learned and acquired in the first game and to expand your armies through a new, bigger, and better land. But it doesn't give you that. It only gives you a new game with a much more annoying world and a character who lost all the fun abilities he had in the previous game. The game does seem to get better as you progress if you ignore the story and just take it for the gameplay, but it doesn't stack up against the game it was meant to expand upon in the first place. Overall, I guess I would still rate this game at least a 7 out of 10 despite its flaws, or maybe even an 8 out of 10, which falls in line with the 83% positive reviews it has on Steam. But I would rate the original game a 10 out of 10 as one of my favorite games, and that's where my problem is with Shadow of War. Also, just saying, the Steam reviews for Shadow of Mordor are actually higher than Shadow of War at 91%, so I'm not the only one who has this opinion. It's a decent game. My problem isn't that it's horrible. My problem is that a sequel should try to be better than the original, and I don't feel like this game has succeeded in that regard. I'm still going to play it from time to time, don't get me wrong, and I do like that it offers more of a challenge compared to the first game, but I'm just really disappointed with how it compares to its predecessor.